Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we got a couple of things to discuss as we continue on with our season preview series. Finishing up the Pacific Division today. Where will the Flames finish and the Canucks finish in the 2023-2024 season? How are they doing in the 2022-2023 season? How are they doing in the offseason this year? And how are they shaping up going into this upcoming season? Definitely, we'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Internet Talker channel. Before we start, remember to like this video, remember to subscribe. We are very close to 200 subscribers, and I would not be able to do all of this without you guys, so definitely don't forget to subscribe. But today we're going to be talking about the Calgary Flames and the Vancouver Canucks and their season preview. We're going to be finishing out the Pacific Division today as we continue on with our season preview series. Start by discussing how those two teams did in the 22-23 season, their additions and losses from this past year, their top 3 picks in the 2023 draft, my current projected lineup for each of these two teams, as well as my current projected point total for each of these two teams, and my offseason grade for these two teams. So we're going to start with the Calgary Flames, who had a decent season last year, were the closest Western Conference team to a playoff spot to miss, but they did wind up missing the playoffs. They finished with a solid record of 38-27 and a surprising 17 overtime losses. That gave them a solid 93 points last year, which was good for 5th in the Pacific. It was good for 9th in the Western Conference. It put them 2 points back of West Canadian rivals Winnipeg Jets for the last playoff spots in the Western Conference. So losing a lot of close games was a problem for Calgary last year. Definitely, especially in overtime. 17 OT losses was not really great for them. So definitely, if they had won just 3 of those OT losses and only lost 14 overtime and won 3 of those games and won 40 games, they will be in the playoffs, not the Winnipeg Jets. So they definitely did really good. It was really close. They did miss out though, and it was a really bad miss out, as a lot of people, including myself, had Calgary finishing as the top 3 team in the Pacific Division. So they went this offseason needing some changes, having a lot of players enter their final year of their deals, and they did some changes, but not as much as a lot of people were expecting. The Calgary Flames, as you can see here, was a significant offseason losses and additions. They had a lot more losses, but they weren't as big as the additions. They lost Milan Lucic to Boston via free agency. Nick Ritchie, who is still a UFA. They lost Tyler Lewis to LA via free agency. They lost Tyler Toffoli in a trade with New Jersey. They lost Matthew Phillips to Washington via free agency. They lost Troy Stecher via free agency to Arizona. They lost Nicholas Malach, who's currently a UFA. And they lost Michael Stone, who retired. So that's their offseason losses. Some decent players there who they lost. Their offseason additions are way smaller. They added Igor Shrangovich in the Tyler Toffoli trade. And they went out in free agency and added Jordan Oesterle. Those are their 2 offseason additions. So Oesterle basically replaces Stecher as a depth defenseman. Shrangovich will replace Toffoli in the top 6. And then they'll lose a couple of bottom 6 pieces in Lucic, Ritchie, and Lewis, as well as Phillips. So once again, not overly significant. They add and subtract 1 on the top 6. They add and subtract 1 depth defenseman. And they lose a couple of bottom 6 forwards, which can be replaced by some of their younger players. So not overly shocked that they didn't do a whole bunch more. They re-signed Mikael Backlund to a new deal. That's good. There's a lot of thought they could still re-sign Elias Lindholm in the next couple of days before season starts. That will be good. But other players like Noah Hanifin, Chris Tanev, Oliver Shillington, and Nikita Zadorov on the back end are all entering the season pending UFAs. So it'll be interesting to see if any of these guys get signed in season, or if the Flames wind up trading all these guys in season. It'll be interesting to see. But definitely, I thought they would have done a little bit more. We know Hanifin could have been dealt at some points. Tanev, Zadorov, Lauren, players who I think they are okay keeping in the final year of their deal. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I'm not overly shocked that they didn't do a whole bunch more, but I was expecting a little bit more movement by Calgary. But definitely, I think the addition of Shrangovich is good in the top 6. I think Oesterle helps out that lower end of the defensive pairings, especially if there's injuries. I do like their additions. I think they could have added some more players as well, but definitely I do think that they did all right this offseason. If you look at their 2023 top 3 draft selections, they had their first round pick, number 16th overall. They selected left winger Samuel Honjic. Solid left winger, eventually should be a solid middle 6'4" for this Calgary Flames team. Second round, number 16th overall, they selected left shot defenseman Etienne Morin. Solid defensive prospect, I think eventually could be a really good second pair defenseman for that team. Third round, they selected Sunev, who I think once again should be a solid third line, the forward eventually in time. So I think the Flames had a pretty good draft. Not an overabundance of draft selections, but they definitely did have a couple of decent picks, and I think Honjic, Morin, I think are some solid picks in my opinion. So Calgary, I think, had a decent draft. Not a flashy one, not one where they're going to have a lot of prospects, but I think they had a solid draft, and I think they did really good drafting. Going over to my current projected lineup for the Calgary Flames, as you can see here, my first line is Jonathan Huberdeau with Elias Lindholm and Igor Shrangovich. The second line is Andrew Mangiapane with Nazem Kadri and Matt Coronado. The third line is Dylan Dubé with Backlund and Zari. And the fourth line is Coleman with Ruzicka and Dewar. I have Uyghur and Anderson, the top pair, Hanif and Tanev, the second pair, and Zadorov Shillington, the bottom pair. Markstrom's the starter, Vladar's the backup, Osterley is the lone spare. Jacob Pelche is probably going to start the season long-term injury reserve after suffering an injury, and that would give them a cap-compliant roster. So Shillington, if he can make the roster, I think he should be a solid third-pair defenseman. There's some injury problems with him too, so I'm not exactly sure if Shillington would make the roster, but they definitely going to have a lot of younger players this year. Coronado, I think, could be a solid top 6 forward. I wouldn't be surprised if Zari got a shot in the top 9. Dewar, I think, is going to be a fantastic bottom 6 forward this year. Ruzicka is going to be a good player. I think this team has a lot of good young youth players who are going to step into the role this year in the forward group. But the forward group looks decent, but it's not the best in the West. Defense, they look really good. If Markstrom and Vladar can rebound from last year's down season, they should be a fantastic team this upcoming season. So going over to my current projected point total for this team, my 23-24 projected point total, I have them finishing with a record of 38, 34, and 10 for 86 points. That's 6th in the Pacific Division and 11th in the West, 7 less points than they had last year. So I have them taking a little bit of a step back. A lot of people do think Calgary can definitely rebound, and I think that's possible. But Calgary's in a really competitive division. I don't expect them to miss the playoffs by too much, but I also don't expect them to make the playoffs. I think Markstrom could have a bounce-back season. I could Vladar have a bounce-back season. But if they don't sign Lindholm and they are on the bubble in the closer to the deadline, which I think is possible, I could definitely see them, even if they're in the playoffs, move guys like Elias Lindholm, Noah Hanifin, Chris Tanev closer to the deadline to try and get some assets. And if they move all these guys, I could see them sort of slow down after the trade deadline and sort of stumble a little bit. And I think that could lead them to missing the playoffs. So I think with all their still pending UFAs, I still think there's a possibility that they could try and trade them at the deadline if they're not guaranteed a playoff spot. And I think that could wind up pushing them down a few spots and having them miss the playoffs. But I think they're going to be competitive. If any of the teams who I predicted missing the playoffs wind up making the playoffs, I think Calgary will be one of the more likely teams to do it. They're a solid team. I think they're going to be a really good team this year. But I personally, in my opinion, at this point in time, I do not see them making the playoffs. Going to my offseason grade, I currently give them a decent C+. They didn't really do much this offseason. They needed to move Tyler Toffoli because he knew he was not going to resign. They got Shrangovich back in return. They added depth defensemen. They're going to have some good youth in their roster this year. Had a decent draft, but they still have a lot of questions about their pending UFA. So given all of that fact, they were able to sign Backlund too, but given all of their pending UFA possibilities, given the fact they didn't do a lot more than I thought they would, I'm giving them a C+. A little pretty inactive offseason this year for the Calgary Flames, but a decent one at this point in time. So a good offseason, not a great offseason for the Flames, but I definitely think they warrant the C+ rating, and I expect them to miss the playoffs this year with 86 points. Going over to the Vancouver Canucks, who also missed the playoffs last year. This team finished with a record of 38, 37, and 7 for 83 points, 6th in the Pacific, 11th in the Western Conference, 12 points back of the Winnipeg Jets for the final wildcard spot in the Western Conference. Definitely, it was not a really good season for the Canucks. Fired their head coach in season, hired Rick Tocchet. After they hired Rick Tocchet, they started to play a little bit better. So hopefully that leads to more good things this year. Tocchet's a really good coach, so hopefully that helps them a little bit. The Canucks are still a solid team in my opinion, and they improved this offseason. I think going into this offseason, they needed to revamp their team, look at some of the players that they could add, and I think they did really good. If you look at the players who they lost and had added here, the losses, they lose Tanner Pearson to Montreal. They lose Justin Dowling to New Jersey. They lost Kyle Burrows to San Jose. They lost Ethan Bear, who's currently still UFA. They lose Travis Dermott to Arizona. And they lose Colin Delia to Winnipeg. In exchange, they add Teddy Blueger. They add P.S. Suter. They add Carson Seuss. They add Matt Irwin. They add Ian Cole. And they add Casey DeSmith. So all in all, I think they had a fantastic offseason. They lose Dowling and Pearson. Pearson did not play overly much last year. Dowling was more of a depth player, so losing those two guys are not too bad, but they bring in Blueger, who's a solid fourth-line center, and Suter, who's a solid third-line center. Both those guys could definitely be solid bottom six additions there for the Vancouver Canucks. They add Carson Sousa on the defensive end. They add Matt Irwin on the defensive end and Ian Cole. They also lost Oliver Ekman-Larsson in a buyout last year, so they lose Ekman-Larsson, Bear, and Dermott, and replace them with Thuis, Irwin, and Cole. Thuis should be a solid physical top six forward who can work really well in that top four. Cole, Irwin should definitely be solid third pair defenseman. Irwin, I think, could be a good seventh defenseman for the Canucks. Cole should be a solid third pair defenseman with veteran experience, knows what it takes to win the Stanley Cups. Adding all of those guys is fantastic. They get rid of Delia, not overly fantastic, but they add Casey DeSmith, who's a solid player and I think should definitely be a solid backup, way better than any of the backups last year for the Vancouver Canucks. So, in my eyes, a lot of great things to look at their additions and losses. Forward group improved in my opinion. Defense looks a little bit better, a little bit more stabilizing. Goaltending wise, a little bit better of a backup for Demko. In my eyes, I think they had a pretty good offseason. Looking at their top three picks in the 2023 draft, in the first round, number 11th overall, they took Tom Willander, right shot defenseman, who I think eventually could be a solid top four defenseman, maybe even top two defenseman for the Canucks. So that was a solid draft pick. Third round, number 11th overall, they selected Henry Brucewicz, who's another right shot defenseman. I think eventually could be a solid second, third pair defenseman for them. And on the third round, number 25 overall, they selected left shot defenseman Sar Mainio, who they've already signed to a ELC, and I think in time could definitely be a solid third pair defenseman. So some really good additions there via the draft. They definitely went defensive heavy, but I think there were a lot of really good picks, and I think the Canucks had a really underrated and really good draft. So in my eyes, I really did like the Canucks draft. If I look at my current projected lineup for the Vancouver Canucks for this upcoming season, I have Kuzmenko playing on the top line with Pettersson and Bouvillier. I have Höglander on the second line with Miller and Besser. I have DiGiuseppe on the third line with Suter and Garland. And I have Studnicka on the fourth line with Mikheyev and Blueger. I have Hughes and McWard on the top pair. I have Seuss and Ronick on the second pair. And I have Cole and Myers on the third pair. Demko as a starter. DeSmith as the backup. Joshua, Dries, and Rathbone as the spares. Pullman starts on long-term injury reserve, and that would leave them with a cap-compliant roster. So, in my eyes, I think they have a fantastic forward group. They did not really move anyone off their forward group except for Pearson, which gave them enough cap space to be cap-compliant. Their forward group looks scary. Their defense, maybe a little bit weaker than last year, but I still think it's a little more stable than last year as well. They'll definitely have a solid defensive core. Goaltending-wise, they still have a healthy Demko, who's definitely going to be a really good starter. DeSmith is a fantastic backup. In my opinion, this Canucks team looks scary. My current predicted point total for this team, I have this Canucks team finishing with a record of 43, 32, and 7 for 93 points, 5th in the Pacific, and they get the second wildcard position in the Western Conference. I have 5 teams making it from the Pacific Division this year, 10 more points than they had last year. So I don't have them having a huge jump in points, but I do have them having a pretty significant one in points. I think 93 points could definitely get them into the playoffs. They're going to be competing with a ton of teams, in my opinion, for the last wildcard spot in the Western Conference, and I think they, in my opinion, have shown this offseason they could possibly be that team to grab that last wildcard spot. The Canucks, in my opinion, warrant a B rating this offseason. They definitely done really good. Could they have done a little bit better? Yes, I think there's a possibility they could have done a little bit better. Maybe shed another forward contract to get a younger player in the lineup. Maybe add another solid top four defenseman to really improve that team. But in my opinion, they had a fantastic offseason. The defense looks a little bit better, adding Seuss, adding Cole. The forward group definitely looks better. They get rid of Pearson while adding Blueger and Suter. I definitely like the addition of DeSmith as Demko's backup. In my eyes, the Canucks had a fantastic offseason this year. So I think the B rating is warranted, given how well they did this offseason. And I also think that the improvements this offseason by the Canucks will push them into the playoffs and finally break their playoff drought and get the Canucks into a playoff spot as a second wildcard team. So definitely, that's all I'm going to talk about here today. Definitely, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments. Do the Canucks warrant a B rating? Do the Flames warrant a C plus rating? Do the Flames miss the playoffs, or will they wind up making it back into the playoffs this year? Can the Canucks changes lead them back to the playoffs, or will they miss the playoffs this year? Definitely, I think the Flames and Canucks, in my opinion, are going to be fighting for the last wildcard spot with a couple of other teams in the Western Conference, but definitely, I'd love to hear what you guys think about the Flames and the Canucks entering this upcoming season down in the comments below. Definitely, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. That's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you're like to, remember to subscribe down below. I also have a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so definitely check that out. I'll leave it down in the description below, and I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.